Hello, my name's George English. I'm the Director of Research Through People. We made this video for those of you with lost family. I mean, typically we find sad situations where children are being given away for adoption or even have been foundlings and have lost contact with their parents. But even situations sometimes people want to just make contact with living relatives, when we're particularly looking at the last 100 years or so in the records, where there's more and less, but where we've got very few leads in terms of where to go with this. So let's have a look at this, and we're going to pick one or two examples which helps to illustrate what we can do for you if you would like. And factors in tracing ancestry always apply. Now what's interesting in this situation is that in terms of status, obviously there's certain things apply and certain things that don't. Let's say it's the mother in particular that has given up the child for adoption. They've carried on living. They've been an owner or tenant of a house. Records will be kept because they paid taxes perhaps, or they were a voter on the electoral roll. And they may have gone on to become a parent, marry again, and so on and so forth. They carried on doing things that human beings do. Can we trace records to do with that? The records themselves, obviously, the registration started in the 1800s. Typically here we're looking at births, marriages and deaths in the 1900s. The census, the last one that's been released so far, is 1911. So the census doesn't often play a part, although you'll find in the first example that yes, it does. The internet has made a lot of things easier, and sometimes we can find the person on the internet. And there are other things like directories, electoral rolls, newspapers. Name and continuity, the same sort of things apply. The surname, is it easy to trace or not? Continuity, did the person stay in the same place or have they gone somewhere else? So let's look at an example. So here we have someone that was born in the Second World War in Bristol in the West Country, and had been given up for adoption. So in fact, one of the things we did for that person was to look at their adopted parents, and some very, very interesting stories, because on the father's side he was from Wales, and the mother's side from Ireland. So there were some very interesting dimensions and things that we found on that side, which of course was of great interest to him. But he was also interested in, well, what about my natural parents? And the natural thing in the recent years, in the 1900s, is there's been a formal adoption process. So the individual can go to the adoption people and see the records. So we arranged for that to happen, and he went and found that his original name was Peter Robson, and basically he got, well, all he really got was from the adoption records was the name of his mother and an address which happened to be in Hampshire. So that was the little hook we had to start with. Could we get any further? Well, yes, we could. What was interesting there was, in fact, we looked at the address, and in the electoral roll it recorded all of the people living at the house. So there were 3 or 4 names over a number of years before and after the Second World War. And so we had the name of Norah Robson, and we also had some other names which we suspected included her mother and father. Luck plays a part, and we got a bit lucky here because we looked at the 1911 census, and would you believe Norah was born just 4 months before the 1911 census, the last census that had been released. And so here we are, and she wasn't in Hampshire, or she was up in the north of England, in Northumberland, and we knew that Alfred and Margaret were people who were living with her in Hampshire. And so, sure enough, father and mother and a couple of her, Ernest and Edna, her brother and sister. And so we got a firm sighting, so to speak, and basis, and we could build back from that. And so from that we got back in the family. And so here is the most recent generations. There's Norah. We found that she in fact had 4 other siblings. We found her parents living, father was from just west of Newcastle, mother was across from Cumberland, etc. But we found that. And then, okay, we've got Norah. What about her? And then we investigated her, and in fact there we are, we found her actual birth, and it confirms her mother and father. And then she went on to live a life, sure enough. So after, basically she had Peter during the war, gave up for adoption, married after the war at Sydney Pito, and unfortunately, of course, we're looking in the in the 2000s, in the 21st century. The husband Sydney had died in 1964 and Norah had died in 1986. But other brothers and sisters had gone on and married and had children. And so we managed to make contact with a grandson of one of Norah's sisters. And he had all sorts of information. He'd met Norah, knew her well, etc., had photos and so forth. So we were able to go back to the client and say, here is a photo of your mother, here's what she looked like, and here's information about. And there's some lovely emotional moments when you're able to give this sort of information to someone who has lived for 50, 60 or more years without knowing this information. And just a brief note of the sort of information sources that we use that were useful in this sort of case. So that's Norah Robson. Let's take another one, the other side of the world. So there's Joan Brunton. She's born in 1951 in New Zealand, in Dunedin. And of course had been adopted and knew all about that. She'd actually found out who her natural parents were. Her father had come out from England and her mother was actually born in Australia. And in fact she'd met her natural father and had been at his funeral. But all she knew about the mother was that she was born in Melbourne in 1922. Could we help? Well, fortunately the answer was yes. So what we started off with, we knew Moya was born in Melbourne 1922, we knew she was in Dunedin in 1949 and that Joan had been born in 1951. And we found the address in Dunedin where both her and John Goodman lived. And you guessed they met up and things took their course. Anyway, we're trying to look back in time. So what we found, in fact, Moya's family lived in Melbourne and actually lived in Canterbury in Victoria for 30 plus years. So we found various records about them. And then what about Moya? Well, we actually found it on a passenger list. She'd married someone called Bennett and sailed from London to Melbourne, so she'd been out there. In fact, she'd lived in Malaya. I mean, she'd had a very interesting and varied life, which was hard to track down, but great that we were able to do so. And essentially she'd then married again a George Smith and they'd gone to live in Queensland in Australia. Sadly, she died in 2005, aged 82. So didn't miss it by much. But again, we were lucky that she had brothers and sisters, and we made contact with living descendants of that who had all sorts of information. And again, a list of the sorts of information that we looked at. Trove is an Australian website which is very helpful, and we get that sort of background information. So we were able to add to more her current information, if you like, but then what about where she came from, her ancestry? And what was interesting was we found that her father was David Brunton, was born in Tasmania, and her mother had actually, and the Smiths had come out from England. Now, if you look at names like we do, you see a name like Rattray and you immediately think Scotland. Ha! Would you believe? Yes. In fact, David's father, Donald, had come out to Tasmania in the late 1800s, and in fact his father was from the borders in Scotland, and there are various other stories there. Now again, what's interesting, can we not only find who the ancestors were, but can we bring them to life? Well, yes, we could. William Brunton was actually the rector, the head teacher, headmaster of Paisley Grammar School for some 25 years. What do schools do? The history, they write books. So we found this history of the school with some like 30-40 pages about William Brunton and a photo of him, which we were able to give to. And from the relatives, we were able to get a photo of Brunton. So again, we were able to give Joan, obviously not her name now, not only information about her mother, but photographs and so on and so forth, and contact with living relatives who had known her. So let's take one other slightly different situation. So here we have John Shirt, born in the Second World War in Birmingham, and we traced his ancestry in the Midlands of England for quite a while. And in fact, in that case, on the mother's side, the family were from the Nottinghamshire and Northamptonshire in the Midlands of England. On the Shirt side, we traced back to the East End of London. And in fact, one of the ancestors had gone out to Australia, emigrated. And in fact, we got back to the early 18th century. Now, Daniel Shirt married Frances Nixon in 1942. Unfortunately, after the war, they had two children, two sons, Daniel and John. After the war, they divorced. And one of the sons went with the father, and one of the sons went with the mother. And there'd been virtually no contact since. What had actually happened here was John Shirt had married and had died literally in 2027, as you see, the year before what would have been their 50th, their golden wedding anniversary. And the wife thought it'd be rather nice to be able to find out about her husband's ancestry. Well, we did that. Now, what came up almost through the conversation was there was this other son, and we said, I wonder if we can find him and make contact. Well, short answer is yes, we could. And there was a very emotional phone call because, of course, Daniel, whose name had actually changed, had not had any contact for 30, 40 years, been totally unaware of the other side of his family. And so again, very special that we're able to facilitate and make those sort of reunions happen. Now, just in passing, one of the documents that become available in the last couple of years is the 1939 register. With World War II looming, it was decided we need to do a register, a census of everyone in the country so we know who's who and where they are. So in fact, we found this Daniel shirt before the First War. In fact, but he'd been married before, and in fact, things had happened there. But there's the entry in the register. Now, what's quite interesting, his father, we also found his father Daniel in the register. So he was born in 1872. Now, he was married to Ada Shirt. The family did not know that he had remarried. And you would think in more recent times people would know these things, but it's fascinating how often we find information that is not there. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. And if it's of any interest, whether you're adopted or not, or whether you just want to make contact with other living relatives, please get in touch. We have a free consultation period. Send information to us, we get back to you. So when we agree to start, you know how much it will cost. We know how far to go with the research. There are our contact details. Email us at Research with People. You can phone me on my mobile if you wish. There's our website, and we've got a whole lot of videos now that you can look at that may give you a better flavour for what's involved. And we have a gold, silver and bronze package which we will tailor to your requirements. So thanks very much. I hope you found that interesting.